She wanted the deed to my lake house. She said it right there, at my 70th birthday dinner, with 43 guests watching their plates go cold. My son-in-law didn't say a word. He just sat there and let her do it. And my daughter, who I walked to school every morning for 9 years, who I held in the hospital the night she had her first panic attack, at 22, who I danced with at her wedding right there on that same property. She looked at me from across the table and said, "Dad, just hear her out." I heard her out. I wished I hadn't. Let me back up, because you need to understand who I am and what that house means before any of this makes sense. I spent 31 years building a construction company from a single truck and a used set of tools into something that employed over 200 people at its peak. I didn't inherit money. I didn't marry into it. I poured concrete in 100-degree summers and negotiated contracts in church clothes I'd ironed myself the night before. When I sold the company 8 years ago, 2 years after my wife passed, I took the proceeds and I simplified my life. I paid off everything. I kept the lake house in Western Virginia, the one my wife and I had bought as a weekend getaway back when we were still scraping together grocery money, the one we'd renovated room by room over 20 years, the one where my daughter learned to swim and my son learned to drive a boat. I kept that house because it was the only place left on earth where I could still feel her. My wife had been gone for 10 years by the time this happened. 10 years. I still wear my ring. My daughter married her husband 6 years ago. I liked him at first. He was polished, confident, the kind of man who knows the right thing to say in every room. He worked in commercial real estate, or so he said. I came to understand later that his version of working in commercial real estate meant identifying properties other people owned and finding ways to position himself between the owner and the profit. He was a middleman who believed he was a visionary. My daughter thought the sun rose and set on him. I kept my opinions to myself because that's what fathers do. They bought a house 2 years into the marriage, a 4-bedroom in a suburb of Richmond. I gave them $150,000 for the down payment as a wedding gift. I told them it was from me and from their mother, because she would have wanted to be part of it. My son-in-law shook my hand and called me generous. My daughter cried and hugged me for a long time in the driveway. That was the last time he thanked me for anything. Over the next 4 years, I gave my daughter money 11 times. I kept a ledger, not because I'm that kind of father, but because my accountant told me to for estate planning purposes. 11 times. Some were small. 3,000 here, 5,000 there when they had a leak in the roof. Some were not small. There was 40,000 when his business deal fell through and they were 3 months behind on the mortgage. There was 22,000 when my daughter had a medical situation that their insurance barely covered. There was a personal loan of 60,000, documented on paper, interest-free, that was supposed to be repaid within 3 years. The 3 years came and went. I didn't bring it up. The total, across 6 years, was just under $300,000. I am not telling you this to paint myself as a saint. I know I enabled some of this. My son mentioned it once carefully, because he knows me, and I told him I didn't want to hear it. That was my mistake, but I want you to understand something. I never gave that money expecting gratitude. I gave it because she was my daughter, and I could. The error I made was not the giving. The error was in never letting the consequences teach them anything. My 70th birthday was on a Saturday in late October. The lake was that particular shade of gray-green it turns in autumn, and the trees along the ridge had gone full red and orange. My son had driven down from Pittsburgh with his wife and their 2 kids. A few old friends came. My business partner for 30 years made the trip from Charlotte. My daughter and her husband arrived last, 90 minutes late, and my son-in-law walked in without a jacket despite the cold and immediately started talking about the property to one of my friends, asking what he thought the acreage was worth, how much waterfront footage there was. I noticed it. I filed it away. Dinner was my wife's pot roast recipe, made by a woman from our church who has cooked for me on important days since the funeral. It was good. People were warm. My old partner gave a toast that made me cry. and I'm not ashamed to say so. The kids ran around the dock until my son herded them in. For a few hours, it was exactly the birthday I had wanted. Then dessert came out, and my son-in-law cleared his throat. He started talking about investment potential, about how property like this was sitting underutilized, about how a man my age shouldn't be maintaining a place this size on his own. He used phrases like estate optimization and generational wealth transfer, and he said them with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who has rehearsed in the mirror. He said my daughter and he had been thinking about it for a long time, and they felt it was time to have an honest conversation about the future of the property. I looked at my daughter. She was studying the tablecloth. My son-in-law said they would take over the maintenance, the taxes, everything. He said it made financial sense for me to transfer the deed now rather than let it go through probate. He said they had already spoken to someone, he used the word consulted, about the valuation and the transfer process. I asked him what he meant by transfer the deed. He said he meant sign it over. To the two of them. He said it as if I had asked a mildly stupid question. 43 people in that room. My old partner staring at his cake, my son's wife with her hand over her mouth, my grandchildren thankfully distracted at the kids' table in the corner. My son sitting very still, the way he does when he's deciding whether to speak. My daughter finally looked up. She said, "Dad, it makes sense. You're getting older. You don't want the burden of all this, and it would help us a lot right now. You know things have been tight." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "How long have you two been planning this conversation?" She said they'd been discussing it for a few months. I said, "On my birthday." She said the timing wasn't ideal, but they'd been trying to find the right moment. My son-in-law said, "And I will remember this until the day I die," he said. "Walter, at some point, you have to think about what's practical rather than what's sentimental." He called me Walter. In my own house. On my birthday. He called my wife's memory sentimental. I set my fork down, very carefully. The way you set something down when you're deciding what to do with your hands. I told him that I needed a moment, and I excused myself from the table. I walked out to the dock. The water was black, out past the reach of the porch lights. I stood there for maybe 4 minutes, and I made 2 phone calls. The first was short. The second was shorter. When I came back inside, the room had the particular uncomfortable silence of people who have been quietly arguing about whether to intervene. My son caught my eye. I gave him a small nod. He sat back. I sat down at the head of my table and I looked at my son-in-law. And then I looked at my daughter. And I said, as calmly as I have ever said anything in my life, the answer is no. The house is not available for transfer. It was not available a week ago. It is not available tonight. And it will not be available at any future dinner. And I want you to understand something. This is the last time this conversation will happen in my presence. My daughter said, "Dad, you're not being reasonable." My son-in-law said he thought I needed to think more carefully about the tax implications of my position. My son stood up from the other end of the table. He said, quietly, that maybe everyone should take a breath. My son-in-law looked at him and said something I won't repeat in full. The short version is that he suggested my son had always been the favorite, and that this whole situation was partly his influence. He said it in front of everyone. He said it with complete composure, as if delivering a prepared statement. My daughter did not tell her husband to stop. I looked at my daughter for a long time. She met my eyes for about 2 seconds and then looked away. I said, "I'd like you both to leave." My son-in-law laughed. Actually laughed. He said, "Walter, you're being dramatic." I said it again. "I'd like you to leave my home." He started to say something else, and my old partner, 68 years old, former Marine, built like a man who never stopped working, stood up from his seat and said, "Son, the man asked you to go." That ended the debate. They left. My daughter didn't hug me at the door. She walked past me, and my son-in-law told me I was making a mistake, and I held the door open, and I watched their headlights disappear down the gravel drive. I went back inside. I apologized to my guests. Nobody wanted the apology. My old partner squeezed my shoulder. The woman from my church started clearing plates. My grandchildren were asleep on the couch, completely unbothered, which was the only mercy of the evening. My son stayed after everyone left. We sat on the porch with the heat lamp going, and he asked me if I was all right, and I told him honestly that I didn't know yet. He said he was sorry he hadn't said more at the table. I told him he'd said exactly enough. We didn't talk much after that. Sometimes you don't need to. The next morning I called my attorney. I had drawn up a will years ago. Standard stuff. Split evenly between both children with the lake house designated for my daughter because she'd always loved it more. I told my attorney that I wanted a full review. I told him I had questions about the $60,000 loan, about documentation, about my options going forward. He told me to come in Thursday. I also called my bank. I had set up a standing monthly transfer to my daughter's account when her husband's business got rocky, $2,000 a month, intended as a temporary measure. Running for 19 months by that point, I called and I stopped it. I want to be honest with you. My hand didn't shake. That surprised me. I thought it would. Thursday came, and I drove into the city and I sat across from my attorney, and we went through everything. The $60,000 loan was documented. It was callable. We discussed what a revised will might look like. We discussed what a trust structure for the lake house might accomplish. I left with a folder and a lot to think about. My daughter called me 4 times that week. I let them go to voicemail. Her messages started apologetic and graduated into a tone I recognized from when she was a teenager, a kind of controlled exasperation, as if my feelings were an inconvenience to be managed. The 4th message included the phrase, "You're punishing me for his behavior," which told me everything I needed to know about how she had processed the evening. Her husband texted me once. He said he hoped we could move past this like adults. I didn't respond. 3 weeks after my birthday, I sent my daughter a certified letter through my attorney. It contained a formal notice that the $60,000 loan was being called, per the terms of the original agreement. It contained written confirmation that the monthly transfer had been discontinued. It contained a letter written by me, not my attorney, in which I said that I loved her, that I would always love her, but that I was no longer willing to participate in a financial relationship that was being treated as a one-way arrangement. I told her the door was open. I told her the conditions were simple. Her husband would never raise the subject of my property again. She would acknowledge what happened at my birthday dinner, and they would begin making payments on the loan. I have not heard from my son-in-law since. I heard from my daughter twice, once to tell me the letter was aggressive, once to say she needed more time. I told her to take whatever time she needed. Now, I need to tell you about the part that changes things. The part I promised in the first 2 minutes and made you wait for, because that's how stories like this actually work. The twist doesn't come from nowhere. It was always there. You just didn't have the angle to see it yet. My wife was meticulous about things I never was. She kept records, wrote letters, made arrangements long before they were necessary. When she was first diagnosed 18 months before she died, she spent a quiet weekend going through papers and making calls I didn't know about until much later. I found out after the funeral that she had set up a small trust, funded through her own life insurance policy, separate from our joint estate. The trust had one beneficiary, our daughter. The trustee was my wife's older sister, who lives in Seattle, and who I have always been close to. The trust had a condition. It was my wife's handwriting in the original letter of instruction, dated about a year before she passed. The condition was simple. Then now. The funds were only to be distributed to our daughter on the occasion of what my wife called demonstrated independence. Meaning, my wife had seen enough of her daughter's tendencies, had loved her enough to name them honestly, and had structured a gift around the hope that her child would one day stand on her own feet. My wife's sister had been watching, quietly, from Seattle. She had been watching for 10 years. She had been in contact with my son, who knew about the trust and had respected my wife's wish that I not be told until the time was right. She had been waiting for exactly the moment that my daughter would either rise or fail to rise. She called me the day after my birthday. I hadn't spoken to her in several months. She opened by asking how the dinner had gone. I told her. There was a silence on the line, and then she said, "I was afraid of that." She told me about the trust. She told me what her sister had written. She told me that the trust had enough in it to give my daughter a genuine, clean start, if she ever chose to take it, and that it would sit untouched, and eventually roll into a charitable foundation, if the conditions were never met. I sat in my truck in my own driveway for a long time after that call. My wife had known. She had loved our daughter fiercely and without reservation, and she had also known her. She had understood, in that quiet way she understood almost everything, that a daughter who is always caught will never learn to fall correctly. She had left behind a gift wrapped in the one condition that required our daughter to earn it. I have never loved my wife more than I did in that parking lot. Here is where I am now. The lake house is mine. The deed is, for now, going into a trust. My son is the trustee with explicit, irrevocable language about its disposition. My attorney has seen to that. The $60,000 loan remains on the books. The monthly transfers remain stopped. My daughter knows none of the details about her mother's trust, because her aunt and I have agreed that she will be told only when she is ready to hear it. My son drives down once a month. We fish in the morning and watch bad movies at night, and he doesn't ask me how I'm holding up because he knows I hate that question. My grandchildren call me on video sometimes, which his wife encourages, and I am grateful for that. I turned 70 years old at a table, surrounded by people who have known me most of my life, and before the night was over, I was asked to hand over the thing that means most to me in the world by a man who thinks sentiment is a liability, and a daughter who chose, in that moment, to look at the tablecloth instead of at me. I am not angry anymore. I want you to know that. Anger was the first response, and it was useful for about 48 hours, and then it became a weight I didn't want to carry. What I have now is something more like clarity, about what I will and won't accept, about what a relationship requires from both sides, about the difference between a parent who loves and a parent who funds. My wife built something into her daughter's future that her daughter doesn't know exists. A door, already built, already paid for, waiting for the right hand to reach for it. I hope she reaches for it. I told my son last month, out on the dock after dark, that I still talk to his mother sometimes when I'm out there alone. I told her what happened. He asked me what she said back. I said, "Nothing. She didn't have to. I already knew." He laughed. He sounds like her when he laughs. I went inside, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the house that still smells faintly of the lavender she kept in a jar on the windowsill, and I thought about all the things a man builds in 60-plus years on this earth. The business, the money, the money, the money, the reputation. The family and I thought about how, in the end, only some of those things hold. The water was still outside. The trees were bare. The house was warm. It was mine. It was hers, and I was not moving.